and thank you again for joining us. My name is Monica Young. I am president of Old Pueblo Archaeology Center, the Tucson, Arizona nonprofit organization that is bringing you this third Thursday Food for Thought presentation. For tonight's third Thursday program, Old Pueblo is delighted to welcome our guest presenter, Dr. Stephen E. Nash. We would also like to congratulate Dr. Nash for taking over from our colleague, Bill Doley, as president and CEO of Tucson's Archaeology Southwest nonprofit organization this past January. It's good to know that Archaeology Southwest is still in good hands and thriving. Dr. Nash earned his PhD here in Tucson at the University of Arizona in 1997. Before coming to Archaeology Southwest, he worked at the Field Museum in Chicago from 1997 to 2006 and the Denver Museum of Nature and Science from 2006 to 2023. Dr. Nash is an expert on the history of archaeological tree ring dating, the history of museums, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, also known as NAGPRA, and the subject of voluntary returns from museums to source communities. He has written or edited 9 books on a wide range of topics and has published nearly 36 peer-reviewed articles. He also authored more than 60 curiosities columns for the sapiens.org online anthropology magazine. And just this year, the Society for American Archaeology awarded Dr. Nash its Curation and Collections Management Award in recognition of a quarter-century's work on orphaned and legacy museum collections. In his presentation this evening, our presenter will examine the history of Southwestern archaeological tree ring dating to explore what might or might not be reasonable to infer from large sets of tree ring dates. We are happy to welcome Dr. Nash as this month's third Thursday Food for Thought guest speaker.
Thank you so much, Monica and Alan, for that kind introduction. I am thrilled to be back in Tucson, folks. It has been a long time since I've lived here, and the Old Pueblo has a special place in my heart. And as Monica said, I spent a lot of time here at the University of Arizona studying tree ring dating. My eyes are not good enough and my patience is not sufficient enough for me to spend the day looking at through microscopes at the tree rings and doing the cross dating myself. But what I spend a lot of time doing is thinking about how archaeologists make use of the finest archaeological dates available anywhere in the world prior to historic records. And one can make the case that tree ring dates are in fact better than historic records, written records, which are created by people with agendas. So what I want to talk about tonight is an embarrassment of riches. I didn't say the embarrassment of riches. I said an. That's a critical distinction here because, again, I love tree ring dates. I love what we can do with them. We can do all kinds of wonderful analytical and interpretive things with them, but I want us to be careful. So I'm going to share with you some case studies of work that I've been involved in through Crow Canyon Archaeological Center and other entities, first at Mesa Verde National Park, and then to a degree in the northern Rio Grande. And what I want to do is share with you some insights about how large tree ring date distributions are created. Because in many sciences and statistics and so on, people equate larger sample size with more robust interpretations, more statistically valid interpretations. And that's okay if the data that you've got are randomly or normally distributed. It's not okay if there is systemic bias inherent in those data sets. And so what I'm going to be talking about is some of those systemic biases that I would argue archaeologists have not spent a lot of time thinking about, and therefore we run the risk, we don't necessarily do it, but we run the risk of over-interpreting the patterns that are evident. So let's take a trip back to Mesa Verde in the early part of this century. There is Cliff Palace, as it looked when around the time Richard Wetherell and company, quote unquote, discovered Cliff Palace. It looks like an archaeological site. It is not ADA compliant, as Cliff Palace almost is today. And so one of the reasons that I show this ancient photograph, couple reasons, is that the area was remote, it was rustic, it was difficult to work in, and so on. But Mesa Verde National Park, as an administrative unit, is 1/3 of Mesa Verde, the geomorphological landform. And this is going to be critical to the distributions that I show you in going forward. So there's an image of Cliff Palace from back in the day. Here is a map to get you oriented a little bit. Pay attention to the peculiar polygon down there, for lack of a rectangle and so on, that is Mesa Verde National Park down there in the lower right. And you can see it's got a bizarre shape. In fact, when the U.S. Congress established Mesa Verde National Park in 06, 26, something, back in the day when they established it, they got the survey wrong. So one of the critical cliff dwellings, I think it was Cliff Palace, was actually not in the park. And then they had to go back and re-describe the legislation. So it doesn't make sense in terms of the geomorphology down there. It makes sense from an administrative perspective. But keep that shape down there in the lower right, the green one in the lower right, in mind as we go forth. So Southwestern Colorado, Mesa Verde, you can see the other cities and towns there. Here's another image. You see the exact same shape, but this one zooms in on Mesa Verde National Park itself. And I want you to pay attention to Chapin Mesa there, which is the first mesa that was developed for visitation. And then Wetherill Mesa over there to the west, which was the second mesa that was developed for visitation. Because the history of archaeological research and the history of tree ring research on these two mesas is going to impact the dates that we see in a little bit. Note also the brown area encompassing the lower half of Mesa Verde National Park. That is Ute Mountain Ute Indian Reservation land. That area has not been surveyed as extensively. Effectively, it's not been surveyed by archaeologists, but there are cliff dwellings and pit house sites all through that reservation. So the sample that we have for Mesa Verde National Park is exquisite because it's received a lot of attention. Again, only 1/3 of the landform, and therefore we presume 1/3 of the sites have really been properly documented and scarcely examined. So keep that in mind. Here is an image provided by Crow Canyon Archaeological Center in Cortez, Colorado. This is about 15 years old, and the exact numbers don't matter. The patterns matter. Each one of the white or light blue dots there is a documented archaeological site. And you can see there are road surveys and excavations with road widening projects there in the green and the upper portion of it where there's lines cutting through it. You can see large blobs of intensely documented sites. Those are areas where, for whatever reason, Crow Canyon Archaeological Center and other entities have done intensive survey, 100% survey, and documented everything. Look at Mesa Verde National Park, evident, as is the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation in brown. Ute Mountain Ute Reservation doesn't have a whole lot of documented sites in there, but you can believe that the density is equivalent to that in Mesa Verde National Park to the north, which is, again, that bizarre shaped polygon there with some offshoots coming out. That is called the gap in archaeological knowledge, folks. What's happening on the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation there. We just haven't gotten in there and documented those sites. And it doesn't matter why, it's just a fact. We've documented tons of things there in Mesa Verde National Park, not in the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation, even though it's the same landform. There is, again, the area that we're going to be focusing on because it's the area that's received the most attention from tree ring dating perspectives. All right. So Mesa Verde National Park, a quick history of Mesa Verde National Park. Established, there it is, in 1906. It's 52,000 acres. That oblong shape is 52,000 acres, and 6,000, more than 6,000 archaeological sites have been documented by the Park Service in that oblong polygon. It is, by dumb luck, one of the best places in the world to conduct tree ring analysis. The trees that grow there are sensitive to precipitation fluctuations. The trees that grew there and were used by people are well preserved in the cliff dwelling environments. Even in the pit house sites where wood does not preserve, a lot of them were burned, culturally burned. And so there's charcoal remaining in those sites, and you can do tree ring dating on charcoal. So just by dumb luck, it is one of the best places in the world for tree ring dating. But I'm going to emphasize this throughout. Preservation of samples of wood and charcoal samples is not random. Mike Schiffer did a lot of work on site formation processes back in the day. There are many reasons why it's not random. Some of them are behavioral, some of them are natural, but the preservation of samples that can be tree ring dated is not random. It is, however, systematic. That is, if there's a cliff dwelling, there's more likely to be wood preserved in that. So keep these things in mind as we go forth. Now, Mesa Verde, especially Mesa Verde National Park, not the landform so much, but the park has been loved to death. One can make this argument. Euro-American visitation began in about 1874. The Wetherill family and Gustav Nordenskjold were going in there in the 1890s, ostensibly excavating. One could make the case that it was looting. Nordenskjold gets arrested in Durango, Colorado, trying to ship collections back to Sweden. He spent some time in jail, and then he is freed because the Colorado judge realized that there's no law on the books saying that he couldn't take that material back to Sweden. That leads in part to passage of the Antiquities Act in 1906. In 1910s and 20s, there was a lot of tourism, relatively speaking. Today, compared to today's numbers, it's not much, but there was a lot of tourism down to Mesa Verde. But it was a long, arduous trek to get there probably from Denver, Colorado, maybe Albuquerque. But it was take the train to Denver, maybe take the train down to Walsenburg, but then you're in horse-drawn wagons all the way over to Cortez or Mancos before going up into Mesa Verde. It was not a trivial thing. And for those of you who have been to Denver and Colorado Springs, you may have heard of Manitou Springs Cliff Dwellings. Manitou Springs Cliff Dwelling is a private, quote-unquote, museum that is made out of an archaeological site that was dismantled in Mancos Canyon, I believe, and moved to Colorado Springs and then rebuilt as a cliff dwelling as a business opportunity. It was trying to cut off the tourists from going south to Walsenburg and over to Cortez. They just moved the site up there and built a cliff dwelling and said, here you are, folks. So if you go to Manitou Springs, please note it's not a real cliff dwelling. In the 1930s, Cortez, as in many parts of the Southwest, archaeological sites received a lot of Depression-era work attention, Civilian Conservation Corps, Works Projects Administration, and so on. So there was a lot of work developing Chapin Mesa, the first mesa that was developed for visitation in the 1930s. In the 1940s, after the war, travel booms in the United States. People are restless. They want to go out and have a good time and go see things. So a lot of visitation at Mesa Verde National Park skyrockets. 1946, I believe, was the first year that they surpassed 1 million visitors. And think about it. It wasn't an easy place to get to. There are no flights, or very few flights to Denver and Albuquerque and so on. People were driving, but they had 1 million visitors down there in 1946. It's extraordinary, and the facilities weren't up to snuff to deal with it. So a little bit of a delay there, but then federal money comes in to develop Wetherill Mesa, again to the west of Chapin Mesa. And so from 1958 to 1967, an extraordinary amount of archaeological research, including archaeological tree ring research, happened on Wetherill Mesa. A lot of the work was focused up on the mesa top, which is where the pit house sites were, which means that the tree ring samples they were getting out were charcoal. And those pit house sites date to early in the occupation sequence at Mesa Verde, and we're going to see the results of the Wetherill Mesa project on the tree ring date distribution here in a little bit. But keep that in mind. Wetherill Mesa is a big deal for archaeological tree ring dating. Also in the 1960s, I want to mention the University of Colorado had some field schools there. Bob Lister in particular was leading the student excavations of certain sites. That has an impact on the dates that we're going to see here in a little bit as well. And then in the 1990s to about 2011, tree ring folk over at the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research, Jeff Dean and Jim Fairchild Parks and others were engaged in an effort to do 100% sampling activities in the cliff dwelling sites to make sure that every single piece of potentially datable wood in those cliff dwellings had been dated. And they did a great job. They spent a lot of time at Longhouse and at a bunch of the other places I can't remember off the top of my head, but some backcountry sites and so on. In 2008, 9, 10, I basically did a mop-up operation and went back to the sites that they didn't sample and got the very last of them. I can say with near certainty right now that every piece of datable wood in cliff dwellings, not in the pit house sites, but in cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde National Park has been dated if it will date. And so there isn't any more that we can do for additional dates in those cliff dwellings from the administrative unit that is Mesa Verde National Park. Of course, there would be tons of samples that would come out of Ute Mountain Ute Reservation if they ever wanted us to sample those and date those. And then, of course, keep in mind that between 1996 and 2003, really, it's closer to 60% of the park burned. The good news is not many of the cliff dwelling sites were impacted by this, except for by erosion once the vegetation ran off and so on. But Mesa Verde has had a rough go of it over the years in many ways. But all of these things impact archaeological research and archaeological tree ring research in the park. Finally, I wanted to note that when Gustav Nordenskjöld sent objects and ancestors to Sweden, he then sold them to, I forget the exact story, but he sold them to the Swedish National Museum, which then turned them over to Helsinki, Finland. And so the Mesa Verde collections were in Finland. When I went to Helsinki in 2016, I told them I was from Colorado and an archaeologist, and they said, "You're not going to ask for the stuff back from Mesa Verde, are you?" And I said, "Nope, it's not my bailiwick." But in 2020, they actually returned the ancestors finally, and it's a good thing that they did. So there has been a repatriation from Finland back to the Hopi. I believe the Hopi were taking the lead on that repatriation and reburial. So not all of the material and folks that Gustav Nordenskjöld took back in the day are still in Europe. Some are. All right. The reason that I want us to look at tree ring date distributions and how they're created stems from some quotes from a book called Leaving Mesa Verde. Mike Berry and Larry Benson, good guys, just scholars who see the world differently than I, published the following statements. Number one, there is no reason to suspect intentional systematic bias in the regional tree ring record. Leaving aside what the word intentional means in this context, because I don't really know what it means, I would just say they argued there is no reason to suspect systematic bias in the regional tree ring record. I would suggest that instead of accepting that statement at face value, we see it as a hypothesis that requires some examination, some testing. They also said the very large sample size of tree ring date distributions lends confidence to the representativeness of those distributions. Again, large sample sizes equals reliable interpretations. So what they did in their chapter in Leaving Mesa Verde is use tree ring dates as a proxy, as a rough estimate of tree cutting activity. Seems reasonable enough, right? You know that humans cut these trees down. That's a reasonable enough proxy. They also used it as a proxy for prehistoric construction episodes like house building and so on, and for population trends. So they're coming further and further away from the raw data and making inferences that I would argue are less and less supported. And they would agree with me, I think. But where I really had the initial quibble was systematic bias, and that large sample sizes obviate the need for additional historical or contextual analysis. Then in 2016, Kyle Basinski, another good guy, friend of mine, worked at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. They published a really sophisticated study using tree ring dates, and they said potential sampling biases still exist because of uneven preservation and investigation. Absolutely true. But the size of our database and the robustness of the patterns identified by Mike Berry back in 1982 are reassuring. That's the one that I have some challenge with. So let's go back to the data and take a look what it is that's happening in the construction of these big tree ring date distributions. So our task tonight is to deconstruct that. That is the database of 19,233 tree ring dates from the Four Corners region and from the Rio Grande region that I created, that I amended, fixed, put contextual and historical information into for Crow Canyon Archaeological Center for their Village Ecodynamics project. It is a big, robust, intense, cool, fascinating database. 19,233. What's not to like, folks? That's a robust pattern. Look at it. Right? We've got tree ring dates dating back to the AD 400s. We've got a peak in the 600s, another peak in the 800s, another peak in the 1000s, another peak in the 1200s, another peak in the 1400s. My goodness, there's periodicities of 200 years here, folks. That's science. We got something happening here, right? Well, I'm going to challenge us to deconstruct this thing from a historical perspective. All right? So what we're going to do is look at the history of archaeological tree ring research at Mesa Verde National Park and the Four Corners region and the Rio Grande region a little bit, but mostly focusing on Mesa Verde National Park. This is going to be, we're talking about how the science of tree ring dating, archaeological tree ring dating developed, and we're going to look at 4 years in this history, 4 specific years in this history, 1929, 1951, 1974 and 2012, because that date distribution curve, as it existed in those years, looks different depending on what year you're looking at it at. Okay? All right. So, history of tree ring dating at Mesa Verde National Park. The first samples were collected there in 1923 by Andrew Ellicott Douglass of the University of Arizona. His first beam expedition went there and they collected samples. You can see on the right there, Harry T. Getty collecting a tree ring sample in 1933. They did it with hollow bit cores and they had to drill up. It would take them 2 hours per core to collect a sample. It was rough work, but that's the way that they did it. The first tree ring dates available for Mesa Verde National Park were published in 1929. And remember, we're going to look at the date distribution for 1929. There's Getty in 1933. He tried and tried and tried to get Civilian Conservation Corps and Work Projects Administration money to do a big sampling project at the lab. I mean, at the park. Was never successful. But he did some work and collect some samples up there just on a limited scale. From the 40s to the 50s, there were small tree ring dating projects up there, but nothing gigantic. In 1951, Tara Smiley of the Tree Ring Laboratory published a summary of known archaeological tree ring dates in the Southwest, including some from Mesa Verde National Park. We're going to look at the date distribution that he had in 51. Again, Wetherill Mesa Project, 58 to 67. Those dates were published in the 1974 so-called quadrangle report from the Tree Ring Laboratory, which was a synthesis of all tree ring dates from a quadrangle around Mesa Verde. And that was the state of the art in 1974. And then, as I mentioned, 100% sampling of cliff dwellings. So the last year that we're going to look at this date distribution is in 2012. Again, the idea here is that we're trying to test whether or not there's systematic bias, spatial and temporal bias in the tree ring date distributions that we see. Again, there is lots of datable charcoal in the park. There's in the administrative areas of the park, there's probably not any more datable wood. All right, short version of what I'm going to show you in graphs here. 1929, six sites from Mesa Verde National Park yielded 12 dates. Not much of a sample to go on, but at that point, archaeologists literally didn't have any idea how old the Mesa Verde sites were. They thought they were 2,000 years old. Turns out when these tree ring dates are published, they're only 1,000 years old or 800 years old. So it compressed their whole calendar, their chronology in which they had to interpret Southwestern history. This is the story that I tell in my book, Time Trees in Prehistory. Google it, you can find it. It was my dissertation, really cool history of science story. But archaeologists were making guesses at that point, and they were off by 100% when they guessed. 1951, that's Tara Smiley's summary. In it, he publishes dates for 26 sites at Mesa Verde National Park, and I can't see the number there because I've got images on my screen, but I think it's 134-ish, something like that, number of dates for Mesa Verde National Park. 1974, oh, I'm sorry, it was 13. Nope, 13. Anyway, you can see the number. I can't. It's a jump, but it's still not a ridiculous number there. 1974, after the Wetherill Mesa project, 78 sites and 1,700 dates. It's an order of magnitude more dates. It's a much better data set with which to work. By 1990, not much had changed, but then in 2012, there's 143 tree ring dated sites at Mesa Verde National Park and 4,351 tree ring dates from the park. Again, size is impressive. Does it help us? We'll see. So here is a graphic presentation. I didn't do 1929 because there was 12 dates. It's not worth graphing, but here's the graph of Tara Smiley's tree ring date distribution. Only cutting and near cutting dates. These are the tree ring dates that basically show the death date of the tree. I'm not including here non-cutting dates because those are missing the human behavior that we're interested by an unknown number of years and in some cases decades. So we're sticking with the really good tree ring dates. But you can see Tara Smiley's date distribution here. There is a small peak of 12 dates in the 890s. So pit house sites, late pit house sites. You can see that there is a smattering of dates from the 1000s there. And then you can see this kind of peak in the 1200s going up to the 1270s. It looks reasonably like the sort of story that we tell ourselves about the occupation of Mesa Verde. A lot of people back in the 800s and then it tapers off, and then a whole bunch of people in the 1200s before, boom, people stopped living there, or at least stopped making houses there. But let's look at the contextual information that Tara Smiley did not publish and find out where these dates are coming from. And what you see is that cluster of dates in the 890s mostly comes from a site called Farview Group number 12, from one site. By the same token, the cluster of dates in the whatever that is, the 1270s, it looks like, for 18 dates from the 1270s are all from Cliff Palace, one site. We know that there are 6,000 sites within the administrative unit of Mesa Verde National Park. I ask you, how representative is Farview Group number 12 and Cliff Palace of the rest of those sites at Mesa Verde National Park? We don't know. We can make inferences, but we don't really know. So I'll get to that in a little bit. All right. What did the tree ring date distribution look like in 1974? Here we have a graph, and you can see the blue line there. That says 1951. That blue line indicates the largest peak that Tara Smiley had in his date distribution, which was from Cliff Palace, you'll remember, in the 1280s. That was the biggest peak. So you can see with Mesa Verde, with Wetherill Mesa having been explored and examined, we get a lot more dates, and we get some interesting new developments. That peak that was in the 800s, evident in Tara Smiley's distribution, is huge now. It's pit houses. It's huge. It's the largest peaks in this date distribution occur in the 800s. And some early pit house sites get tree ring dated by the Wetherill Mesa project in the 600s and the 700s. And then look at the peak in the 1200s from the cliff dwellings. Not only is Cliff Palace's peak not the biggest is in the 1240s. It's not in the 1280s. So this date distribution looks radically different. And if we're going to interpret population or construction activity or other kinds of things from at Mesa Verde National Park based on the distribution of tree ring dates, you've got to explain to me what we're going to use, the 1951 curve or the 1974 curve. Obviously, we're going to use the one that's most recent and most complete, but you've got to explain to me how you know that this date distribution curve is representative of all of the activity in Mesa Verde National Park. So let's take a look at the contextual information here and find out where these dates came from, some of them. So you can see the peak in the 600s, it's exclusively from Wetherill Mesa. How representative is Wetherill Mesa of the entire administrative unit or the entire landform? I don't know. Bob Lister's Field School, which I mentioned, excavated one pit house in 68, 69, I don't know when it was, but that one pit house was exquisitely well dated, and 29 dates from basically the same year in the 730s accounts for that one peak by itself. This huge peak in the 800s comes from the excavation of 3 pit houses and 1 kiva. How representative are those 3 pit houses and 1 kiva of the spatio-temporal variability at Mesa Verde National Park? I can't tell you, and I don't think the excavators could either. And then that big peak in the 1200s comes exclusively from Spruce Tree House, not Cliff Palace at all. All right, so let's go and do this one more time to belabor the point. Here is the distribution in 2012, when all of the datable wood from the cliff dwellings in the administrative unit have been dated. You can see 2 blue lines there on the left, 1951, 1974. You can see that 100% sampling activity in the 1990s and 2000s has led to a gigantic peak there in the 1200s. The peak in the 800s hasn't changed much. The peak in the 600s hasn't changed much because there hasn't been much excavation in pit house sites anywhere in the park in the last, since the Wetherill Mesa project ended 50 years ago. So this is what we've got, folks. Contextually, where do these come from? The big peak in the 600s comes from Step House Cave Pit House, a single pit house in Step House Cave. Again, that peak in the 800s is still from those same 3 pit houses and 1 great kiva. And then we've got the 100% sampling. So I ask you then, on site formation processes, I want to point something out here. Cliff Palace, lower left, Longhouse, lower right. Longhouse is on Wetherill Mesa Verde, Wetherill Mesa. Cliff Palace is over on Chapin Mesa. Cliff Palace was sampled, has been completely sampled and yielded a total of 63 tree ring dates. Longhouse was intensively sampled by David Street in the 1990s. It yielded 643 tree ring dates, an order of magnitude more. The question is why? They're the largest cliff dwellings on their respective mesas. They're 3 miles apart or something. It's possible that the wood at Cliff Palace was taken to be used at somewhere else by the occupants of Mesa Verde. We also know that Richard Wetherill and Neil Judd and other people who were conducting fieldwork in Mesa Verde National Park prior to the advent of tree ring dating used logs, beams from these sites as firewood. And we can gasp and scold and say that was not good, and it's a bummer for tree ring dating purposes. But I would encourage you to think about going camping in Mesa Verde National Park or that landform with a 1920s technology, no Nalgene, no Gore-Tex, no none of that. Do a hard day's work and then go out and get firewood from somewhere else. I'm pretty sure you would be tempted as well to simply burn a beam from that cliff dwelling. So I just point that out as one other source of systematic bias in the tree ring record. One cliff dwelling, another, they're contemporaneous, but one's got an order of magnitude more tree ring dates. So we want to think about whether or not it's reasonable to use these data, again, as proxy measures for any of the things that Berry and Benson were using them for. So I ask you, which date distribution should we use? Clearly 1951 is insufficient, but it looks sort of like the date distribution that we are so fond of today. 1974 looks really bizarre because it looks like, if it's a proxy for population, it looks like there's more people there in the 600s and the 800s than there were in the 1200s. I can't answer the question as to whether or not that's true, but I hope that you're getting suspicious about conclusions that are based solely on tree ring data. And then, of course, you've got the 1974 distribution. So which one is the most reliable? Obviously, larger sample sizes are better than smaller ones, but it's not the case that they're free of bias. All right, very quickly, what I want to do is share with you a couple of examples from over in the Rio Grande Valley. This is the date distribution of cutting and non-cutting dates in the Rio Grande Valley from between 400 and 1600. And I simply point out 3 different projects that led to the big peaks in this distribution. The excavation of Pot Creek Pueblo yielded 353 dates, a huge number in that 80-year span that's marked by red up at the top. Excavations at Pueblo Largo yielded almost 300 dates from that 60-year period there from the 1200s. The excavation of Tijeras Pueblo led to 265 dates from a single decade, led to that peak there in the 1385, 1395 range. My point here is simply that the history of archaeological research matters, and that the contextual information behind these tree ring dates absolutely matters, because we then have to determine how representative these sites were and how representative the excavation of those sites were. Remember Bob Lister's excavation of a single well-dated pit house? That has implications for archaeological research as we go forth. All right, so let's go back to the challenges that I laid out at the start of this presentation. Berry and Benson wrote, there's no reason to suspect intentional systematic bias. They also said large sample size lends confidence to the representativeness of the distribution. And then the robustness of patterns are reassuring. That's what Kyle Basinski and others said. I'm not so sure. And I hope at this point that you're not so sure. Let's take a look at the temporal distribution. Let's remind ourselves of that spatial distribution, right? Mesa Verde is one small sample of that landform. These distributions are full of systematic bias that is both temporal and spatial. Are the databases large enough? I would say no. And some folks who are smarter than me have used Monte Carlo simulation as a complex statistical technique to address this problem of systematic bias. I checked with Dave Miko and others at the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research who understand Monte Carlo simulation and things. And the trick is, if you're putting bias data in, which they did, you're going to get bias data out. And that's just the nature of the beast. There's nothing you can do with it. Monte Carlo simulations work really well if you've got a random distribution going into it, or normally distributed distribution going into it, et cetera, et cetera. So complex statistical techniques, I would argue, aren't going to get us out of this problem. And then some folks have suggested a Bayesian analysis approach. And the only thing I would say here is to quote an expert and say, when the underlying incidence of something in a population is low, false positives can dominate the results. And again, the number of tree ring dates that we have in this distribution, while it's extraordinary, is still minuscule compared to the universe of trees that were cut down and burned during the occupation of Mesa Verde National Park. And I'm going to try and give you a hint as to how rare it is. The chances in the project area of known sites in this area, the chances that any one of those sites will have been properly excavated and recorded by us, by archaeologists, is less than 1 in 1,000. There's 10,000, 20,000 sites in that region. There's only X number of tree ring dated sites. So, or there's only X number of excavated sites. So it's less than 1 in 1,000 sites have been excavated and recorded. The chances that an excavated and recorded site in Mesa Verde will yield a single, or in Four Corners region, will yield a single tree ring date is 2%. It's not bad, but it's 2 out of 100 sites will yield a single tree ring date. And then that a single tree ring sample will date. Remember, Mesa Verde is one of the best places in the world to do archaeological tree ring dating, but only 40% of the samples that are ever submitted yield dates. And I'm not going to go into why that is, but there are reasons for it that don't have to do with us archaeologists or anybody else. It has to do with the trees themselves. But this is where, if you went into Bayesian statistics and injected prior probabilities into it, this quote about the underlying incidence of something in a population is low, false positives can dominate the results. These are low figures, folks. So if you use this in Bayesian analysis, you run the risk of getting false positives. So what is the embarrassment of riches? I change it from "and," I change it to "the" now. There is a guy that you may not recognize, but who is famous for something that he said. That's Whitey Bulger, who is a bank robber. And somebody asked him, "Why do you rob banks?" And he said, "That's because that's where the money is." Genius, right? You don't go and rob a store that doesn't have any money. You go and rob the banks. So why are some of the sites at Mesa Verde National Park really well tree ring dated? Because it's a great place to do tree ring dating. But not all sites yield dates. Where do we get tree ring dates from? We get them at archaeological sites where the ancient people used datable tree species. If they built those cliff dwellings out of cottonwood, there's no tree ring dating, folks, because cottonwood doesn't date. We get tree ring samples, we get tree ring dates from sites where wood and charcoal are now well preserved. Wood and charcoal gets really well preserved at Mesa Verde National Park. Wood in the cliff dwellings, charcoal in the Mesa Top pit house sites. Incredible preservation up there. And we get tree ring dates where archaeologists have done field work. Can't get tree ring dates if people haven't gone out and collected and then submitted the samples to the tree ring laboratory. So all of this is contingent on behavior, both in the past as well as in the present, and on natural preservation processes. One of the challenges for us is that we cannot predict where future tree ring dates are going to come. We know that the last tree ring date that we've got from Mesa Verde National Park right now is 1282. And there's very few dates from the 1280s. There's a bunch from the 1270s, but that precipitous drop in the 1270s, up to 1282, I believe is real, and it's something that's been documented across the Four Corners region. We know that people stopped building sites up there at around 1282-ish, but we can't predict where future tree ring dates are going to land in the earlier part of the distribution. The other thing that I would close here with is just that the embarrassment of riches, tree ring dates will give us calendar year dates. They're wonderful. They will give us seasonal dates in some cases where you can say that tree was cut in the spring or that tree was cut in the late summer after the growing season. We can get seasonal data out of these things. But the vast majority of archaeological data that we use, we're lucky if we can get 25-year periods, sort of roughly a human generation on that, through ceramic cross dating and maybe some radiocarbon dating with Bayesian analysis. The fact is, tree ring dates are almost too refined for our own good. And I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I want us to keep using the tree ring dates, but they're almost too precise when we use them in contrast to the rest of archaeological data. So I'm going to date myself here, folks, and go back to the 1980s. I suspect some of you will remember that guy from the TV show Hill Street Blues. And at the end of the morning meeting with all of the cops and detectives, he would say, "Hey, let's be careful about out there." And that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying don't interpret tree ring data. I'm not saying any of that kind of stuff. I'm saying just be careful out there with how we use tree ring dates. They're wonderful, but they still have systematic bias in them. I got to praise Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, Larry Benson, Mike Berry, Kyle Basinski for inspiring my work, Historical Society, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you. I will be quiet for a minute and we'll do some Q&A here very, very shortly, but thanks for your time and attention.
Thank you. Before we start with our audience questions and comments, I'd like to ask Al Dart to give you some information about Old Pueblo's mission and activities. Al?
Okay.
You.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Monica. I can get some stuff out of my way so I can actually show these slides. You're reading Old Pueblo's mission here is to educate children and adults about archaeology and other cultures, to foster preservation of archaeological and historical sites, and to develop a lifelong concern for the importance of non-renewable resources and traditional cultures. So I'd like to just give you an overview of some of the things we do to implement that mission. We do a lot of educational tours, some for children, mostly for adults. So some of the ones we have coming up, there's one late this month to the Tucson Museum of Art to look at some of their exhibits on Mesoamerica, focusing on the hero twins, narratives of many Indian groups in North America. And in September, I'll be leading a tour to the Los Morteros Hohokam Village site and the Picture Rocks petroglyph site that you see a sample of here. On November, we have a tour that is already filled to the Badger Springs Pueblo and petroglyphs up in Ironwood or in Agua Fria National Monument. And we also have a tour that's filled on December 7th to Cerro Prieto and some of the petroglyph sites in that vicinity, Trinchera sites as well. The December 7th tour, we have such a long waiting list that we are going to do a second tour there in January. So that will be coming out in our announcements, on our email announcements fairly shortly. Some other tours we have coming up in January. Dr. Vance Holliday will be leading us to the Murray Springs Clovis Paleo-Indian site, and we'll also see some formative period pre-contact sites and historic period mining related sites from the tombstone mining boom of that area. That'll be January 11th. And then on February 8th, Felipe Molina, who is a Yaqui Indian historian, will be taking us to some of the older sites of Yoem or Yaqui communities in the Tucson and Marana, Arizona areas. We offer classes and workshops, mostly online now. We also offer flint knapping courses. We just finished one this past weekend. The course that we have scheduled coming up soon online is one that I'll be teaching on the Hohokam culture of Southern Arizona. It'll be on Wednesday evenings starting on September 4th. We are still taking reservations for that one. We do have enough people for it to go already. We have other online presence, including next month's Third Thursday Food for Thought presentation, in which Kelly Jinks with New Mexico State University will be telling us about NMSU's project at a short-lived Spanish colonial settlement in Cañón de Carnuel, which is in Tijeras Canyon, just east of Albuquerque. So I'm looking forward to that one. I mentioned we'll be including the next tour in our upcoming email announcements. We send out email announcements of upcoming activities, not only of Old Pueblo Archaeology Center, but many other organizations in the Southwest, twice a month. And if you are not on our email list already, you can get onto it just by going to Old Pueblo's website, oldpueblo.org, scroll down to the bottom of that homepage, and you can enter your name and email address to get onto our emailing list for these upcoming activities. So you can also ask to have your name put on if you send us at info@oldpueblo.org. One of our main problems, and one we probably spend most of our resources on, is our children's education programs to teach kids about archaeology. We have a simulated archaeological site set up at our facility in Tucson, which is on a Tucson Unified School District property. where we bring whole classrooms of kids in to teach them about the archaeological method, the scientific method, and scientific and archaeological interpretations. So we're always looking for contributions and memberships, especially to support that program. So also on our homepage, you can find this donate button if you want to pay by PayPal, but we take donations by check, by cash, or with credit cards. So I'll give you some information in the chat. In fact, I already put it in the chat as to how you can make those donations for us. We do encourage you to become members if you're not already a member of Old Pueblo. So in essence here, we're passing the hat, asking for contributions to support our programs, especially our children's education programs here. So this is what I put in the chat a little while ago. You can download those links and get more information on Old Pueblo Archaeology Center. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Al, for sharing that information with us. And now we go into our Q&A. First of all, I wanted to say to you, Steve, that I thought your questions concerning the distribution of sampling are very thought-provoking. They did raise suspicion that I suspect most of us have not been challenged to think about. So thank you. It was very, very enlightening. So we'll begin with, let's see, Henry Dejean said, so what is a good sample size, geodistribution, etc., that would be acceptable in your mind analysis?
That's a great question. I don't think I think the appropriate sample size depends on what kind of question you're asking. If you are interested in the construction of a particular room in that's standalone somewhere, say a cliff dwelling that's just a granary, and it has 3 beams in it, and you sampled all 3 of them, and all 3 of them date to 1240, you've got a pretty good idea that somebody cut down those 3 trees and built that room right around 1240, right? So a sample size of 3 for that could work just fine. Thinking back to Cliff Palace and Longhouse, I'm sure a lot more confident about what we say about how Longhouse was built with 643 dates than with 63 over at Cliff Palace, which is roughly the same size. But I can also tell you that if I had been studying Cliff Palace, didn't know when it dated, I would have been thrilled with 63 dates. And in fact, one of the things that confused archaeologists in 1929, when Douglass published 12 dates for 6 sites from Mesa Verde National Park, the date that they got from cliff dwelling was from old wood. It was a non-cutting date, so it didn't date the date of death for the tree, therefore didn't date when somebody cut it down, and it was 200 years old. So it said Cliff Palace dates to 1010, and for the next 20 years, archaeologists were trying to figure out why Cliff Palace dated 200 years earlier when all of the ceramic assemblages said that it was contemporaneous with Spruce Tree House. So there isn't one set answer to this. I think the trick is it depends on what questions you're answering, in what context, and at what scale. So that's what I'm looking for. And tree ring dates, we're blessed to get any tree ring dates. Again, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I just want us to be careful.
Okay, Tim Kohler asks, says, to assess the representativity of the tree ring record from MBNP or the NRG, why not compare them to the distribution of population for those areas through time as reconstructed by the VEP, or for the larger VEP2 areas which they form a part? These paleodemographic data are temporarily anchored by tree ring dates, but do not depend on them. The VEP used elaborate techniques to overcome biases in the paleodemographic reconstructions that would allow us to see the directions and the amounts of biases, if any.
Remember when I mentioned those guys that are smarter than I am, that do things like Monte Carlo analysis and so on? Tim Kohler is one of them. Tim was instrumental in me getting hired to work on that database and so on. And I'm going to express my limitations right now. Why not? Because I'm not qualified. I leave that up to you all, and let's continue the discussion. But I do think it is critical, and I hope that I've demonstrated that the historical and contextual information truly matters. Tim, I would invite you to come and give one of the lectures here and address the question that you posed, because I can't do it, and I'm not even going to profess to be able to try.
Steve, can you say what the VEP is that he refers
Oh, Village Ecodynamics Project. So this was the project that Tim was leading, two projects really that Tim was leading in the Four Corners area with Crow Canyon Archaeological Center to reconstruct village ecodynamics in that part of the world and then over in the Rio Grande. So they hired me to help with the tree ring database, first for Mesa Verde, and then we expanded it to the Four Corners region and the Northern Rio Grande, which is what the Village Ecodynamics project was doing, was looking at a smaller area and then those two larger areas. Really, really cool, really sophisticated archaeology, just not my bailiwick, and I'm not even going to attempt to answer that question. Thank you though, Tim. I'm glad you were on.
Frank Grenier says, given the points you've made about drawing broad conclusions about archaeological cultures from tree ring dates, how should this data be incorporated into the overall story of a site or a culture?
Carefully, in one answer, we should incorporate the data carefully. Here's my other problem, is that I have worked in museums for a very long time, right? First at the Field Museum, my job there was to catalog Paul Martin's collection. Paul Martin was a stellar archaeologist from the middle 1900s, from 1927 to 1972 at the Field Museum. He amassed a huge collection at the Field Museum that was never cataloged until 1997. My postdoc was to catalog it. He had a great reputation for publishing site reports immediately after, or within 2 years after, the cessation of excavations. That was the story that I heard as a graduate student. That was the story that was out there. When I cataloged his collections, he had never cataloged or analyzed 95% of the objects that he collected. He also had never published anything on 60% of the sites that he had excavated. My problem is I know too much about what's behind the scenes. So I'm not going to make any prescriptions about how much or what kinds of data we should be using and how we should integrate that. That's for other folks to do. What I'm going to keep reminding people about is that there are big, unpublished, unanalyzed collections in museums all over this country. And the contextual and historical origins of that work matters, because we're not doing digs at the same scale right now. And we should take care of what's in those collections. And how should we incorporate it all together? Very, very carefully and thoughtfully and assiduously. But my problem is I know where the gaps are in our knowledge, right? So I can learn about Chaco Canyon, and then I can tell you where all the unanalyzed material is from Chaco Canyon. And that's my burden, right? It's like being a doctor and having a little kid that gets the sniffles and you think it's something extraordinary and it's just the sniffles. You know too much, right? I'm burdened by this contextual information, which, you know, kind of keeps me up at night. And so I'm not going to tell other archaeologists how to do what they do. I'm simply suggesting one place where I would argue we could be more cautious than we've sometimes been.
Robert Vesley says, I'm confused. Why does the number of samples influence the date distribution that result from those samples, other than having a larger database?
Those date distributions were simply plots of the total number of dates per decade. So one date means one unit on there, and when you've got 373 dates from a given decade, that's where they go. I guess I'm not really understanding it's simply a series of counts of the number of dates. I guess I don't understand the question. Sorry.
Okay. Todd, this is from Todd Bradley. Thinking of the graphic that showed the spatial distribution of dated sites in Southwest Colorado, there's something that looks like a brown oval with very few or no sites at all. Is that the town of Cortez, or is there some other lack of preserved trees in that area, or something else?
Good question. That is Ute Mountain, or Sleeping Ute Mountain. That is the mountain where, you know, the gradients are too steep for anybody to build any houses, but that's a mountain.
Mm-hmm.
thank you for pointing that out. I hadn't thought about where that oval came from.
Okay, so that looks like all the questions we have in our Q&A here. And on behalf of Old Pueblo Archaeology Center, I'd like to thank you, Steve, for sharing with us this evening. We also thank all of you in our audience for joining us tonight. Please consider making a donation to support Old Pueblo's efforts to educate children and adults about archaeology, history, cultures, including through programs like this one. Thank you all and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Steve. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Appreciate it. Have a good night.